Українське незалежне радіо.
Today on Ukraine Watch, I'm speaking with Hans Petter Midttun, a retired officer in the Royal Norwegian Navy and a former Norwegian Defence Attache in Ukraine. He is currently a non-resident fellow at the Center of Defense Strategies. He's also with the Ukrainian Institute for Security and Law of the Sea. Hans, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
So there's a great deal of fear these days that Russia will launch a large-scale escalation of its ongoing war in Ukraine. What's your assessment of what's likely to happen?
Well, first of all, I have to take you back 8 years because it's crucial to understanding what's happening today. 2014, I think the international community was really concerned about the possibility of a full-scale Russian aggression. It didn't happen. But for 8 years, there still has been a war going on in Ukraine. Sitting down and trying to find out what happened in spring of 14 until today, some of us ended up concluding that this is a sort of a hybrid war ongoing for these 8 years. And more than 15,000 casualties or killed in action. There's more than 30,000 wounded in action, civilians, both civilians and soldiers. And it's a conflict based on a parallel and synchronized use of both military and non-military means. The reason for pointing this out is being concerned in spring of 14. When I left my post in 18 and argued that 4 years later, the threat had increased. And 4 years later still, it has increased even more. The reason for that is this buildup of Russian forces along the Ukrainian borders has been ongoing for 8 years. It's been a constant process in parallel with the Russian reform of its armed forces, its building on lessons learned from operations, both in Ukraine and Syria, if you like. And we just see what we've seen recently is just escalation to a process which has, as I said, been on way for quite a while. I'm not surprised. And that goes to your question. I'm not surprised that we are where we are today because Russia has been pushing challenging the international law for quite a while. And we have not responded resolutely. I would even say we have not done anything which would have surprised Russia from the very start. So what will happen? There's a lot of fear of a full-scale invasion, and that is, of course, on the table. I think the intelligence which the United States and its allies have presented to the international audience is solid. The problem is with the intelligence is it just only give an indication of intent. And I would argue there's a lot of arguments against a full-scale invasion. It's on the table, but less likely. I have another different scenario on my mind based on my sort of the development of the hybrid war concept. What is this? Well, I would argue, bearing in mind that the hybrid war concept for 8 years has tried to avoid a conflict, outright conflict with the West. It's also tried to avoid having the West get truly engaged in Ukraine, or, engaged in the sense of providing real defensive support, lethal weapons, and that kind of support. There's also been using the last 8 years building a case. The case is something we could find from previous Russian military interventions in Georgia, for the first place, also Crimea and elsewhere, where they based their operation on, they legitimized their intervention based on the need, the responsibility to protect mode, if you like, the UN Charter. The same basic NATO has used during operations in both Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Libya, and so more, and more. They've created the crisis. They have changed their legislation to support, our intervention. They build a military doctrine around it. They reformed the armed forces to be able to do intervention, and they have recently been building their narrative to support our future humanitarian intervention. I think that will happen in Donbass. It could be, of course, elsewhere, but I think they will limit themselves to Donbass because it serves the hybrid war, and that goes back to my arguments why I don't think we'll see a more full-scale invasion. That's a long answer to your question.
No, I appreciate your insights. Does Russia even have sufficient forces to occupy the entirety of Ukraine?
And that's what I laid out in one of my recent articles. I said there's basically 6 arguments against a full-scale invasion. One is exactly as you question: do they have sufficient forces? Well, in the sense of a shock and awe operation, like we saw in Iraq 2003, from the American force, or the Americans and allies. Well, you find that the force composition is about right. Ukrainian armed forces still have critical vulnerabilities. They're strong in the land forces, but they're weak in air defense and navy, if you like. So the ability to do an invasion is absolutely in place, and Ukraine is in a critical place. However, the one thing which stopped Russia in 2014, when Ukraine could muster about 6,500 soldiers, was not the armed forces as such. It's the true deterrent in Ukraine is the will to fight. They have a proud history of partisan, and as shown Second World War and beyond, until 1954, I believe. Also, they've shown that from 14, how they triggered civil society. And, they created about close to 70 volunteer battalions to stop this incursion in the East. So, no, they have enough forces to invade, but they do not have enough forces to occupy. That said, if they were to occupy, we know from our own experience that you need to rotate forces in and out of the theater. You need to give them rest. You need to do another training cycle. So you have to multiply that forces by 3 even. So I would say they need 400,000 to 500,000 soldiers to occupy the country effectively. But then again, multiply that by 3 just to maintain that occupation over time. That would break the back of the Russian forces. And they will do this operation at the cost of security elsewhere in the Russian Federation. Just 2 of the 6 arguments against it.
So what do you see as Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal in Ukraine? If it's maintaining sort of a hybrid war or keeping pressure on Ukraine, what goals is he trying to accomplish by doing that?
I think it's crucial that we have to be recognized that Ukraine, though essential to Russian grand strategy, if you like, is only still one object of many objectives. Russia is promoting itself as a great power again, on the same basic as China and United States. In order to do that, they need to build the demography for the future to achieve that aim. It's not only about their present military power and their ability to inflict damage, but also ability to maintain that in the future. All prediction on the demography of Russia is, even on the most positive ones, shows a negative development. They need the population of Belarus and Ukraine to achieve that great power status. But that great power status is to project power towards the West and Europe in particular. So in order to achieve this, again, it goes to my argument against the full-scale invasion. Mm-hmm. You need to build the fundament for peace, or a better peace, on completion of this conflict, the hybrid war, if you like. So doing a full-scale invasion will cause massive destruction and casualties. Even the most conservative estimate says about 25 to 50,000 casualties in civilian society, not counting soldiers and similar. Hybrid war, in a sense, low intensity, using non-military means to destabilize Ukraine from within, and over time, not tomorrow, not next year, but over time, creating the condition for having Ukraine want to return to the Russian world. And I have to say this, in great respect to my Ukrainian friends, I find that difficult. Even I find that difficult to see that happens. But this goes again to the hybrid element of it. It's not only about what Ukraine wants, it's also about how the West receives Ukraine. We have not opened the door for NATO membership. The door for a European Union membership still is also barely open. So over time, I think the West have a tremendous say in how the common Ukrainians, most Ukrainians, see their future. Because if there's no support in the West, the only way to stop the conflict is to return back to Russia and say, okay, we adapt in the long term.
Do you see in that scenario, and that's sort of, in my view, it seems like a worst case scenario, if that strategy over time were to succeed, how do you see that affecting the security of the rest of Europe, or maybe even the West more broadly?
I think it's actually probably one of my most important reports I ever wrote. When you work in the international community in Ukraine, you get a clear sense that every nation acts according to their own national interest. Most of the time, national interest is something positive. It's economic cooperation. It's about shared culture, history, and something beneficial for both parties, if you like. But there's also a negative side to this, and that is, as you are referring to, what is the consequences of a Russian victory or a Ukrainian defeat, if you like. And in my mind, it's extremely destructive to European security, because there's two scenarios to this. One is, of course, if the worst comes to the worst, you have a full-scale invasion and you have a full war in Ukraine, bordering NATO. That will have ramification for European security, both in sense of destabilized country, the spillover effect of a conflict, but also on economical and humanitarian consequences. You will have mass immigration from Ukraine. You see, even on rumors of a conflict, you see the stock market, finance market responding negatively. You see the possibility of energy crisis because of how we act, or the war, or the war itself, inflicting damage to the gas pipelines. And then, of course, you have the second scenario, which is like a political surrender, if you like, and Ukraine turning back to Russia, and that will create that scenario which Russia has been claiming falsely is taking place in Ukraine already. This civil war sort of narrative. Ukraine society would respond strongly on our political surrender, and you would probably see our civil war, and the consequence again will be very much the same as the previous scenario. So either way, you will not have peace in Europe. And the economic, the fact that Russia is challenging the international laws, which creates the basis for our own stability and peace and progress, these things being put aside will have tremendous impact on all of us. I've been arguing at my own audience at home that, because we always had, pretty good cooperation with Russia, Russia is among many been perceived as cooperative and even friendly, if you like. I'm arguing that there's only one Russia. And we're not judged by what we say, but what we do. And Russia should be judged by what she's doing in Ukraine. That's not a pretty picture.
So I also want to ask you what your assessment is of the Western response to Russian aggression so far. If you were to imagine that you're advising the President of the United States or commanders in NATO, what would you say about what's happened so far and what might be done or could be done moving forward?
Well, first of all, I think going back to what I said initially, when Russia did surprise many by starting a war in Ukraine 8 years ago. They did it little by little. I mean, they took control of they illegally occupied the Crimea and they took parts of Donbass. And with that, both of those territories, they also took control of a bigger part of Ukrainian maritime economic zones. So currently they are controlling 19.6% of Ukrainian territory plus maritime zone under its jurisdiction. Doing that, I think they were not only laying the foundation for a very cost-effective war, they were also testing the resolve of the international community. 2014, the Western world responded as we always do. Statements of concern and sanctions. And then since 14, and when we imposed those sanctions, which was supposed to change the mindset, motivate Russia to do, step back, Russia has increased its pressure on the West. We've seen an increasing number of intervention in referendums and elections across NATO, European Union countries. We've seen liquidation of Russians in Europe. We've seen immense war of information and so on. They have increased their aggressions and their belligerent language without having a proper response. So that said, I think it's time to step up and draw our own red line, because Russia understand that, and they respond differently to escalation than we do. They will push and challenge us until we push back, and then they will stop and reconsider what to do next. So we need to, first of all, we need to make sure that Ukraine do not fall, that Russia do not succeed in Ukraine, because we do not need to see a even more belligerent and strong Russia, which will be the case if it wins. We need to do some tough decisions, which we should have taken 8 years ago. The fact that we have delayed the increase in defense budgets, the decision in 2014 was to increase the defense budget over 10 years to reach the level we were supposed to be in 2014. How ridiculous is that? We need to build the coercion. And not least, we need to make sure that we act not only by statement, but also act in coercion. Because at present we're not. We're making the same statements. We're equally as concerned, but NATO as such do not act in union. Some nations, 12 nations, do support Ukraine actively. 18 do not. And that's, in my mind, is a sign of weakness. And of course, each nation needs to get the acts together. I mean, I suspect Russia is not acting as it do because it sees NATO and the individual country as strong or united. They're doing this because over 8 years we have shown weakness. And if we do have a look in different nations, we see nations split. There is political issues which is not uniting us at this very important moment of time where we need to sit together. If that in the United States, and we need to see Democrats and Republicans working together and not sabotaging each other's politics. We need to act as one, not only as a union, but also at the individual nations. And we need to demonstrate strength.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. I very much appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. This has been a conversation with Hans Petter Midttun. I'm Dan Tерлецький, and this is Ukraine Watch.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Українське незалежне радіо.